Welcome back, everybody, to part 2 of my reaction to Cold War from Oversimplified. Thank you so much for all the great feedback, especially about the new format. Seems like the majority of people who did have an opinion on it do like the new format. My next question then is, if we're going to keep the format this way, is do you like it with just the black background for the green screen, or would you prefer that I had something else? My preference personally is watching it, as it seems like the black's probably the better way to go. It'd be less distracting than having something else, but you guys may feel differently. So let me know in the comment section below what you think about that. I really don't have a lot to add. Just a reminder and a request that you subscribe if you haven't already. Don't forget to hit like and leave a comment. And please make sure that you go over and check out the original content. The link's in the description. Give them the credit for creating this great content in the first place. It gives us something to talk about. So let's dive right into part 2.
This video was made possible by Skillshare, an online learning community where you can learn just about anything. Support my channel by signing up using the link below and get your first 2 months for free. For anyone who thinks recent US history has never been as crazy as it is right now, allow me to present to you the 1960s, extreme cultural division, major political assassinations, and the closest the world has ever come to nuclear apocalypse. Yep. Shocked by the CIA's intrusive methods for putting down socialism in Latin America, a certain Fidel Castro met with a certain Che Guevara in a bar in Mexico City, and the two of them decided they should grow some awesome beards and overthrow the Cuban government.
And we have talked a little bit about Che Guevara in the past. I did the epic rap battle between Che and Guy Fawkes a while back, so you should definitely check that out. Maybe I'll try to remember to put a link in the description for that. We talked a little bit about his background. I think he's from Argentina. But he ends up getting connected with Castro. He's a doctor by education and ends up being killed later on in another revolution. Fascinating story behind him.
Which is exactly what they did. Cuba had been America's summer playground, and America didn't like seeing a communist regime being set up in its own backyard. So the US immediately began training up Cuban exiles to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro. However, as the day of the operation came closer, Kennedy wanted to conceal any US involvement in the plan. So he massively scaled back American air support, and as a result, the Bay of Pigs invasion was a humiliating defeat for America. But Castro felt there was still an impending US threat to his regime.
And it's fascinating because his goal was to conceal US involvement, and he scaled everything back. But everybody knew the US was involved anyway. So he really didn't gain anything. It only just caused it to be a massive failure.
Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, Kryštof had a lot of medium-range nuclear missiles that couldn't reach America, but they could if they were positioned, say, on an exotic Caribbean island off the coast of Florida. Hey, I'm a communist who hates America. You're a communist who hates America. You know what that means? We should fall in love. I was just going to suggest you set your missiles up in Cuba. Oh, no, you're right. That's a better idea. Be still, my beating heart. On October 14th, 1962, a U-2 spy plane over Cuba noticed something strange. Sir, you need to look at this photograph. You're right. That's the cutest dog I've ever seen. Sir, I was referring more to the Soviet missiles. America freaked out as they realized what was going on. They were completely vulnerable, and they had to act fast.
And, you know, these U-2 spy planes, this is the days before satellites, when you didn't have satellites up there. I mean, there were satellites by this point, but we didn't have spy satellites everywhere that could just take pictures of anything. So you have these high-level spy planes that are taking pictures over Russia. We talked about that in the last episode. And we get these pictures over Cuba. So it's, you know, it's pretty interesting. We knew enough to be checking Cuba out, to be watching for these things. We obviously knew that this was a possibility, that this could happen. And, man, I don't think anybody realizes how close we came to a complete disaster. If you ever get a chance, watch the movie 13 Days with Kevin Costner. It's a fascinating look at what was going on and just how close we really came.
They knew that airstrikes or an invasion of Cuba would likely mean nuclear war with the Soviet Union, so Kennedy came up with another idea, a blockade. The US Navy announced it would stop and search any Soviet ships heading to Cuba, and would sink any that did not comply. In response, the Soviet put its military into full combat readiness. The US did the same, and began drawing up plans for an attack on Cuba. Things were escalating fast, and both superpowers were getting ready for World War III. Emergency communications between the two sides broke down as Kryštof rejected Kennedy's demands for the missiles to be removed.
Compare this to the build-up to World War I, because there's a lot of parallels here. Escalation going back and forth, breakdown of diplomacy, both sides accusing the other one of being the aggressor, and where it went horribly wrong in 1914 in the build-up to World War I, it goes right here. Because rather than continuing to escalate, you finally have a moment where the Soviets blink and they back down, and then that allows both sides to start backing down.
And for the first time in history, U.S. Strategic Air Command moved to DEFCON 2. DEFCON 1 means nuclear war. The Soviets shot down a U-2 spy plane over Cuba. A Soviet nuclear submarine in the Caribbean mistakenly believed war had already broken out, and 2 of the senior officers gave the go-ahead to fire its nuclear torpedo. Thankfully, the 3rd senior officer, this beautiful man, refused to authorize the decision. The U.S. finalized its preparations, and I kid you not, the day before the U.S. were set to decide the day and time for the Cuban invasion, Kryštof was like, "Hey, you know if you just removed your missiles from Turkey, we'd remove ours from Cuba?" Yeah, that sounds good to me. It was a bit more complicated than that, but at the last second, the 2 sides finally came to an agreement.
So, and what they do is they make, so it doesn't look like it was an agreement. The agreement is that the Soviets would back off right away, and that a few months down the road, the U.S. would announce it was pulling its missiles out of Turkey, making it seem like it was completely unrelated to what happened, but it really was kind of a back channel deal that they made.
Soviet missiles were shipped out of Cuba, and the world breathed one gigantic sigh of relief, except for one guy, who was bloody livid. Phew! Let's hope that's the biggest crisis of my presidency. Unfortunately for him, his presidency was to end with one. Having nearly blown up the planet, a few changes were made. First, the superpowers agreed to a limited test ban treaty. Secondly, the Soviets ousted Kryštof and replaced him with Leonid Brezhnev, who was a kisser. He liked to kiss. Both sides were deeply concerned at the prospect of nuclear war, but still, the arms race raged on throughout the 60s and 70s. US intelligence worked out that the Soviets' nuclear arsenal was not as powerful as they previously thought, but in fact, it was America that held the advantage. ABMs and MIRVs were developed, and the doctrine of MAD. If both sides knew they would be completely destroyed by a nuclear war, neither would risk starting one.
Yeah, so mutually assured destruction becomes the thing that prevents any escalation, and when there is combat between proxies, it's always conventional, because both sides fully understood that if either side started a nuclear war, both sides were just going to be done and the world was going to be devastated. So there was no point in doing it. And if there's no point in using the weapons, there's no point in having quite so many weapons.
But even without war, the world was already feeling the effects of nuclear weapons. In 1966, above the pleasant town of Palomares in Spain, a US bomber collided with a tanker mid-air, and 4 hydrogen bombs fell and landed near the town below. It hasn't exploded, so I'm sure everything's fine. Whoa, boy. Hey, I wouldn't eat that if I were you. Okay. What were you gonna do today? Go for a swim? Yeah, I wouldn't.
If you've ever seen the movie Men of Honor, I think that's what it's called, with Cuba Gooding Jr., where he plays the first black Navy deep-sea diver, I believe that these nukes that were lost, that there's one scene in the movie where he's one of the people that's going after one of those nukes, and that's when he ends up losing his leg, is on that mission. I don't know how historically accurate that is, but I'm pretty sure that was the context of that.
Are you breathing right now? Yeah? Yeah. I wouldn't. It took the Americans 2.5 months to find one of the bombs, which had gone missing in the ocean. This was the 14th time America had lost a nuclear bomb since 1950. Nobody knows how many bombs the Soviet Union lost. So sleep well tonight.
Yeah.
After Kennedy's assassination, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson took over, and he inherited a developing crisis in the East, Vietnam. Back in the 50s, the Vietnamese had kicked their French colonizers out once and for all, and the country was divided into 2. In the north, a communist regime, and in the south, an anti-communist regime. Both were led by very sweet-looking old men, but don't let that deceive you. They were both ruthless dictators, and both dreamed of reuniting Vietnam under their own regime.
So you see, he intentionally tells that exactly the way he described the Korean War, because it's basically the exact same thing. I mean, it's all totally the same thing. The difference here is that Korea had been occupied by Japan, whereas this was part of what was called French Indochina, which was a French colony. And when they're run out after Dien Bien Phu in 1954, you have Communist North, Democratic South, both dictators, both wanting to reunite, both being proxies for larger superpowers that are kind of feeding and fueling the fire and wanting to try and push the other side out.
So the North established the National Liberation Front, also known as the Viet Cong, to carry out a campaign of guerrilla warfare in the South with Soviet support. The US sent advisors to help train the South Vietnamese to deal with the threat, but President Diem's brutal policies pushed more and more South Vietnamese to support the Viet Cong. And over the next decade, the situation escalated to a breaking point. America feared the domino effect. That is, if South Vietnam fell to communism, would Cambodia be next? Then Laos? Thailand? Burma? India? LBJ had to make a choice between losing South Vietnam or sending in the troops. And so in they went. From 1965, America found itself in a war unlike anything it had ever fought before. Let's play Spot the Viet Cong Soldier. Did you see him? Of course not. That's because millions of young American men were drafted and sent to fight a ruthless enemy who used the thick jungle as its shield. It was nearly impossible to tell where the enemy was, or worse, who it was. And as a result, the civilian population got caught up in the brutal crossfire.
Imagine being sent to fight in this war. It was. I mean, it was a no-win situation. It was hard enough to figure out who your enemy was. And when you did figure him out, you were constantly having to worry about, am I killing civilians? Am I killing the enemy? You've got booby traps all over the place. I mean, there was just no good way to fight this war without messing it up. We just put our soldiers in such an impossibly difficult situation. And then, of course, with the home front being against it, they came home from a war that was no fault of their own and just had no appreciation shown to them. It just, if there was ever a war that I think pretty much every American wishes had never happened, it's Vietnam.
The city of Saigon found itself under regular attack, and America launched a bombing campaign in the north during Operation Rolling Thunder. The Viet Cong used the Ho Chi Minh Trail running through Laos and Cambodia to supply the campaign. It was a long and brutal war, and I could never do it justice in this video. But in terms of the Cold War, Vietnam was probably the biggest of many, many global conflicts that signaled a turning point. Under the threat of nuclear war, the two superpowers began working to make their relationship more constructive, and as a result, their ideological battle shifted away from the potential of direct conflict and more towards attempting to influence smaller proxy wars around the world. In the Middle East, the Soviet Union provided aid against Israel during the Six-Day War, and then again when the US backed Israel during the Yom Kippur War. In Africa, the Angolan Civil War saw US-supported South Africans fighting Soviet-supported Cubans. In the conflict between Somalia and Ethiopia, the superpowers interestingly switched sides as regimes changed, and the US continued fighting the spread of communism in its own backyard, funding the famous Contra groups to fight the socialist junta in Nicaragua. These proxy wars were fierce enough to begin with, but superpower intervention amplified the destruction and created alarming levels of human suffering.
And, one of the things, speaking a little more modern, the Mujahideen that the United States ends up fighting against in some instances in Afghanistan after the September 11th attacks were the very people that the United States had funded in their war in Afghanistan against the Soviets, not even a generation earlier. So that's how quickly these things are changing. Look at this list. A lot of these you've probably never even heard of before. And even though I've heard of most of them, I couldn't really tell you much about them. But this all was going on at the same time. This is how the Cold War looked. It might have been a Cold War to the United States and Soviet Union, but it was very much a real deadly conflict in all these countries.
Throughout the Third World, and in Vietnam, that human suffering was all being broadcast back home via good old television. Going into the late 60s, America was a changing nation. This became this. This became this. And this became this. The new slogan that was taking root: make love, not war. The majority of Americans did not approve of Johnson's handling of the Vietnam War.
So I want to go back to a second because it showed the segregated drinking fountain and then just drinking fountain. Back in the late 1890s, there was a court case called Plessy versus Ferguson in the U.S. Supreme Court. And Plessy versus Ferguson concerned a guy named Homer Plessy, who was 1/8 black. That was it. He was 1/8 black, 7/8 white. But he was considered black in the South. And I don't know all the details of it, but basically what it came down to is that court case ruled on what was called separate but equal. And what that meant was that as long as you provided facilities or services to people of both races, they didn't have to be together. So if you're a restaurant, as long as you have a section for what were called colored people at the time that was separate from whites, but you still served them, then it was perfectly legal. And so that's how you end up with separate bathrooms for blacks and whites, separate drinking fountains, things like that. To my northern 2021 mind, it seems absolutely absurd that would be okay, that we would even think that way, that somebody had to have a separate restroom and a separate drinking fountain than I do. But that was how things were at the time. And that only changed beginning in the 1950s. There was a Supreme Court case that overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. It was called Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education. and it ruled that separate but equal is by its very nature not equal. And so that began to change. It wasn't overnight, and obviously we're still dealing with a lot of that to this day. But that was when that began to change.
And in 1968, a silent majority elected law and order candidate Richard Nixon. As the Vietnam War appeared to be increasingly unwinnable and public opinion turning increasingly sour, Nixon made the decision to begin bringing the troops home and ended U.S. involvement in Vietnam by 1973.
And, this was a big deal with Richard Nixon. He had been the vice president under Eisenhower for 8 years. He had very narrowly lost the election in 1960 to Kennedy. Some people will argue to this day he didn't lose that election. There was some voter fraud going on that probably cost him that election, and it might have been. But Nixon then runs for governor of California and loses. And he basically decides at that point he's done with politics. But then 1968 comes along. And, of course, in 1968, you have the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in April, I think. And then in June, Robert Kennedy is assassinated the night that he wins the California primary for the president. So he may have gotten elected president in 1968. It's possible. But instead, you have the Republican Richard Nixon winning. And he kind of starts the process of going in the other direction with Vietnam.
2 years later, the South fell. The Cold War was now taking its toll on both superpowers. In Russia, a huge percentage of the budget was still going to the military. People were still hungry, and they just didn't have access to the same lifestyle and goods as the West. And what did they have to show for it? They weren't even winning the space race anymore. Both sides needed to reduce spending in order to rescue their economies, and so both welcomed with open arms an easing of hostilities, otherwise known as détente. To improve relations, Nixon became the first U.S. president to visit Moscow in 1972, and Brezhnev returned the gesture a year later. A number of treaties were signed, including the 1972 SALT Agreement that limited nuclear weapons.
I'm not going to sing Richard Nixon's praises. Obviously, there was a lot of corruption going on domestically. But I think if you look at his presidency objectively and without... And I'm not saying you can look at his presidency without the corruption, because that was a part of his presidency. But in terms of foreign policy, Vietnam aside, he did some really good things. Normalizing relations with China, what they just talked about here with the Soviet Union. Some really good things happened, and I think had it not been for the stupid crap he did with Watergate and that cover-up, he might have gone down in history as a pretty good president.
Relations with China were even improving via ping-pong diplomacy when the U.S. table tennis team went on a tour of the People's Republic. However, internally, China was still pushing anti-capitalist propaganda, which led to some mixed messages. Nixon even visited China in 1972, and it was a barrel of laughs.
Today, the president walks among priceless treasures from China's golden age. Among them, a pair of ear stoppers used by the emperor to keep from hearing criticism.
You put the stopper into his ears so that he couldn't hear the criticism.
Give me a pair.
Everything was going great for Nixon, until it was uncovered that back home he was being a very naughty boy and violating constitutional protocol. I'm announcing today my resignation as president, and I'm passing the office to my vice president, Gerald Ford.
So, interesting thing about Gerald Ford, of course, is that he wasn't elected president or vice president, because a couple years before this, Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, I think it was from Maryland, had also resigned over some corruption that was going on. I think it had something to do with taxes. I don't remember for sure. And so Gerald Ford, who I think was the House Minority Leader at the time, gets nominated. He's the first person to be nominated under a new constitutional amendment that provided for replacing the vice president if that office is made vacant. So he gets nominated, he gets approved, and then Nixon steps down. So there, all of a sudden, Ford becomes president.
Wow, you mean in America the people can actually remove their leader when he breaks the law? Why not just rule by force? Where's the corruption? And my first act as president is to pardon Nixon. There it is. After the whole fiasco, Americans decided what they really wanted was just a nice, safe guy who wouldn't cheat on them. So they elected Jimmy Carter, and the two sides met in Vienna, where they signed yet another strategic arms limitation treaty. It's an honor, Premier Brezhnev. Likewise, President Carter. Please don't do that. But that's not to say there was no longer any tension between the two sides, because there was. Heaps of it. Once again, the Soviet Union put down further attempts at reform and rebellion in the Eastern Bloc. The Euro missile crisis saw new and improved classes of intermediate-range missiles being deployed in Europe. In 1979, the Soviets thought it would be a good idea if they had their own Vietnam and invaded Afghanistan to prevent a US-sponsored Islamic insurgency. And in response to these various crises, Olympic Games were boycotted. Conservatives were...
Interesting thing here, because there's talk of this happening again. There's talk right now of the United States boycotting the Olympics next year in China. I hope that doesn't happen, but you can see that kind of being talked about. In 1980 and 1984, one of those years, the games were held in the Soviet Union. I think Los Angeles hosted the other one, and we boycotted one another's Olympics.
Concerned that US policy had become too soft. And in 1980, they decided they wanted a president who would be tough on communism, so they elected Ronald Reagan. And Reagan came in guns blazing. Concerned at the Soviet Union's human rights violations, he made a speech calling them an evil empire. And he also wanted to renew the arms race using technological advances in computing and lasers. He came up with the Space Defense Initiative, also known as Star Wars, which was basically a big defensive anti-nuke shield around the country. But a lot of people thought it was a pretty dumb idea. The Soviet Union perceived this shift in rhetoric as the USA getting ready for war, and they were feeling especially threatened as their relationship with their communist ally China had broken down. Relations took a big hit in 1983 when the Soviets shot down a Korean airliner that had strayed into their airspace, and it looked like the world was going right back to mid-20th century Cold War tension. But then Brezhnev got really old and died, and was replaced by this guy who was really old and died, and was replaced by this guy who was really old and died, and he was replaced by Mikhail Gorbachev. Coming into office in 1985, he was the real game changer.
Yep. And, as much as people I know in America want to give Ronald Reagan credit for ending the Cold War, totally impossible without this guy, who's still living, by the way. And I tell you, I don't know, I can't speak for every American, but most Americans I know, I think as highly of Mikhail Gorbachev as I do. I think he's always been viewed very positively here. And if you're an American, maybe you can give me your perspective and what you think. But having grown up with it, I remember thinking, this is a guy we can deal with, which is kind of interesting because with Reagan, you had kind of a hard liner, but the two became friends. And when President Reagan died, Gorbachev came over for his funeral. And I think they really kind of understood each other well.
His philosophy differed a lot from previous Soviet leaders. He felt that the reason the Soviet system and economy was struggling was that it didn't allow the Soviet people to find satisfaction in their work, because they weren't allowed to speak freely and lived in fear. Gorbachev wanted the Soviet people to be happy, but unlike previous Soviet leaders, he actually made the change happen. Within the first couple of years, he began the political movement for more openness and transparency, and the restructuring of the Soviet political and economic systems. And change very quickly took effect. People could criticize the government, they could enjoy Western pop culture, the media interviewed Margaret Thatcher, but most importantly, the Soviet people could now enjoy Pizza Hut. All hail to Gorbachev. He also knew that the arms race needed to end in order to rescue the Soviet economy, and a positive relationship with the West must be established.
That was all brilliant stuff, and it was pretty radical for the Soviet Union to go in that direction. And, so it's not just Gorbachev. Obviously, he had to have had some support within his government to be able to make these things happen. So you got to give a lot of credit to Gorbachev, but also the other members of his government for being willing to make these changes that, of course, it opens things up and leads eventually to a coup, but it really kind of led to the end of the Cold War.
Constructive dialogue reopened and resulted in the INF Treaty, which saw all intermediate-range missiles eliminated, which was huge. Reagan's tone towards the Soviet Union began to soften, and things were looking up. But what would these reforms mean for the Eastern Bloc? For decades, the Soviets had been brutally suppressing any attempt at change. Now, would they be allowed? And that was the exact question on Hungary's lips when the Prime Minister visited Moscow. Gorbachev's response, he didn't necessarily agree with the reforms, but he wouldn't stop them either. He was prepared to let the Eastern Bloc choose its own future. This was massive, and the Hungarian leaders began planning free, multi-party elections. Poland followed suit, and also held elections in June. The anti-Soviet party, Solidarity, won 99 out of 100 seats in the Senate. But not just that. In Hungary, the barbed wire border between East and West was removed. The Iron Curtain was unraveling.
And you know, people don't remember that these are the places where it began. We think about Germany, we think about the coup in the Soviet Union and the fall of the Soviet Union, but it really began in some of these satellite states. Romania, they rise up and overthrow the Ceausescu's, their communist dictator. They kill him and his wife. It was a thing that kind of a domino effect that started.
But not all Eastern Bloc leaders were happy. Notably, East Germany was still ruled by a hardline Stalinist, Erich Honecker, and many East Germans were still eager to get out. They had been trapped by the Berlin Wall, but now they were doing the math. If they could travel to Hungary, and Hungary's border with the West was loosening, could they now make it to the West? That summer, East Germans decided Hungary was the latest top holiday destination. They traveled there in droves, and using various methods, tens of thousands crossed the border into Austria and the West. Honecker was furious, and blocked travel to Hungary, but that civil liberties train had started rolling, and it wasn't stopping. Thousands more flocked to the West German embassy in Prague, where they stormed the fence around the embassy gardens, and a temporary refugee camp was set up. In September, deals were struck to allow the refugees to travel west via train. Back in East Germany, the people were running on a civil liberties high, and they wanted their next hit. Dissent was growing. Over time, demonstrations turned to mass protest, with plainclothes secret police officers doing their best to put down the dissent, but it had grown well out of their control. And worse, the biggest demonstration was yet to come. We're gonna put all of this down by force. Right, guys? Guys? Unfortunately, everyone had realized what he had not. This was bigger than them, and the entire East German Politburo voted him out of power.
So there again, you can we've talked about this many times before. If you're a dictator, you can retain control without the support of the people, so long as you have control and support of the military or of the police, the law enforcement body. You lose that and you're done, and that's what happens here.
On November 4th, over 500,000 East Germans took to the streets of East Berlin. For many, there was still one big target left in their sights. That damn wall. The pressure on the East German government was too great, and on November 9th, they made a bit of a chaotic announcement that the travel ban between East and West was being lifted. The change wasn't meant to take effect until the next day, and crossing guards still had orders to shoot on sight any who tried to cross. But that night, huge crowds gathered at the crossing points, and the guards were overwhelmed. In an astronomically historic moment, after decades of family separation and travel restriction, the people were allowed to pass through.
I get goosebumps because I remember that day so well. This was, guys, I don't know how much of it's taught in school anymore. This was a huge deal. I mean, you cannot really grasp it thinking about it 30 years later, what a big deal this was. I got to find it, but somewhere I've got a little piece of the Berlin Wall with some graffiti on it that I bought years ago. Just a massive symbolic moment for these people.
True. East and West Berliners couldn't believe it and celebrated together throughout the night. Some even climbed the wall and began to topple it. The Iron Curtain had fallen, and a year later, Germany would be reunited. Elections in Bulgaria, a peaceful revolution in Czechoslovakia, and a violent one in Romania brought to an end communist authority in the Eastern Bloc. America decided it would be best if it just stayed away and let the change happen, as the anti-communist movement continued all the way back to Moscow. Gorbachev had given the people the freedom to demonstrate. Now, they demonstrated for an end to the communist single-party rule, and Gorbachev had to give in. For the first time in history, elections were held in which candidates not officially endorsed by the party were allowed to run. Ambitious rival of Gorbachev, Boris Yeltsin, led a growing democratic movement. Now things here get quite confusing, and the dissolution of the Soviet Union is a complicated topic, so believe me, this is oversimplified, but it went a little bit like this. The Soviet Union was made up of a number of smaller Soviet republics, the largest of which was Russia. Yeltsin got himself elected the president of Russia, and began a struggle for sovereignty against Gorbachev and the greater Soviet Union. Communist hardliners were horrified at what Gorbachev was allowing, so they briefly kidnapped him and tried to set up their own emergency government. But Yeltsin and his supporters all gathered around the White House in Moscow and were like, no, we have a tank. So the hardliners had to concede and released Gorbachev. Wow, thanks Boris. That was a close one. No problem. And thanks to you for all the great freedom you've given us. Anytime, pal. And just to inform you, I've used that freedom you've given us to go behind your back and make a deal with Ukraine and Belarus to dissolve the Soviet Union and set up the Russian Federation.
Yep.
In other words, you're no longer in charge. I am. Dude. So uncool. And so decades of tension and the everlasting threat of nuclear war finally came to an end as democratic governments were established in many of the old Soviet republics, and the world got along together forever after. Right, guys? Hey, this modern art thing is growing on me. Where can I learn to do that?
Skillshare. Well, I'll stop there, and typically I let the ads play, but since that's the end of it anyway, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up right there. I remember those moments of the late 1980s, early 1990s so well as a 12, 13-year-old kid watching this stuff unfold. It was just massive, and of course, shortly after that, we had the Gulf War when Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait and that whole showdown and everything. But what an incredible world-changing time this all was. And I'm sure we will see moments like that again in the future. But let me know your memories of those events if you're old enough to remember them. Let me know your thoughts about everything we just talked about. And if you have a particular suggestion about what you'd like me to react to next, let me know. I will get to the French Revolution at some point. Don't worry, every Oversimplified video will be covered at some point, but I'm going to get to some other things in the next few days. I'm also working on editing my videos from Yorktown, Cold Harbor, and Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, so those will be coming soon. So be watching for those. Make sure you're subscribed and you have the notification bell turned on. Hit that like button on your way out. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.